Hello, and welcome to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center's Curators Corner. I'm Thorin Tritter, and I am the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, which is located in Glen Cove, New York. This online program, for those of you who don't know, is part of a weekly series that I have been doing since our building was closed because of the corona crisis, and it gives an opportunity for people to look at individual objects in our collection where I can delve a little more deeply into their background and history and significance. Let me encourage you, as always, to post any questions you have using the Q&A feature of Zoom. So if you scroll over the bottom of the screen, or perhaps the top, depending on what device you're using, if you find the Q&A button, you can type in your questions. I might not answer it as I'm going along, but I will certainly make time at the end of the program to go over the questions that are in the Q&A box. Okay, so today I am talking about a photograph in our gallery that shows a group of passengers boarding the St. Louis in Hamburg in 1939. The St. Louis, of course, the infamous ship that came to symbolize the plight of Jews trying to escape from Nazi Germany before the Holocaust and the unwillingness of America to open its doors to those Jewish refugees. I'll talk more about that story in a minute. I should say, however, this is not just a picture of some random group of people boarding the St. Louis. We know who these people are. They are family members of the former chairman of the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, Howard Maier. And their story, I think, offers a much more personal account of the St. Louis than we often read or hear about. And before I go on, I want to thank Howard Maier and his cousin Sonia Geismar for sharing information with me about their family history as I prepared for this presentation. I'm really very grateful for their help. Let me step back and give a bit more information about the St. Louis, or as Gordon Thomas and Max Morgan Witt called it, the Voyage of the Damned. That was also the title of the 1976 film with Faye Dunaway and Malcolm McDowell. The background starts with the rise of Adolf Hitler in 1933 and the Nazi Party's desire in the period before 1941 to expel all the Jews in Germany and Austria. When we think back about the Holocaust, we always think about the 6 million Jews who were murdered by the Nazis and their effort to destroy all of the Jews in Europe. In the years before 1941, however, Hitler's goal was not yet genocide, but instead expulsion. The Nazis passed literally dozens of laws, beginning in 1933, that gradually took away the rights of Jews living in Germany and Austria and were designed to encourage the Jews to leave. Of course, it wasn't just as simple as getting the Jews to leave. Hitler and the Nazi Party wanted the Jews to leave, but didn't want them to take their savings or assets with them. So to encourage Jews to leave and give up their savings, the Nazis gradually made life more and more miserable, restricting the jobs the Jews could have, boycotting Jewish businesses, as you see in one of the photos here, or limiting their freedom, publicly humiliating them, as another photo here, and randomly committing acts of violence against them. The big turning point for Jews who had resisted calls to leave before 1938 was the pogrom known as Kristallnacht on November 9th and 10th of 1938. All over Germany and Austria, Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues were burned or destroyed or attacked. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested across the country on this one night and taken to some of the early concentration camps of Dachau and Sachsenhausen. After many weeks in detention, most of those arrested were released on the condition that they leave Germany. That is what is the case for one of the people in our photograph. The photo shows 3 people boarding the St. Louis, or at least that's what it looks like at first. The man in the photograph is Ludwig Maier, Howard Maier's oldest uncle. In front of him is his Aunt Bertha, Ludwig's Aunt Bertha, and behind him is his wife, Freya. Ludwig had been born in 1901 in Malsch, Germany, about 20 miles east of the Rhine River and the border with France. His father, David Maier, was a successful cattle dealer, and Ludwig was the oldest of David's 5 grown children. We actually have 2 pictures of Ludwig in our museum. Both are part of our photo wall that stands in the opening to our museum and shows pre-war life. Here's one of those pictures that shows most of the Maier family. Perhaps you can recognize Ludwig and his wife Freya, the same people who are boarding the St. Louis. They're in the back on the left. The picture also shows two of Ludwig's younger brothers, including Siegfried, who was later known as Fred, and whose son Howard Maier later moved to Nassau County and helped establish our museum in 2009 when he was serving as the chairman of the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center's board. And in the back on the right is Ludwig's and Fred's brother Leo and his wife Gertrude. Probably around the time that this picture was taken, 2 or 3 years before Kristallnacht, the family may well have discussed the idea of leaving Germany and moving somewhere new. But their businesses, their friends, their whole family, their whole lives were in Germany, and that stopped them. David's youngest son, Fred, and Ludwig's youngest brother, would be the first to leave. As a single young man, he was seen as the family member who could most easily adapt to a new life in another country. And in February of 1938, he sailed for New York and initially moved in with a member of his sister's husband's family. Meanwhile, back in Malsch, the rest of the family largely stayed put. But on November 9th, 1938, Ludwig was one of the 30,000 Jews arrested in Germany. He was sent to Dachau. And after 5 weeks of punishment and abuse, he was released on the condition that he leave Germany. 7 months later, paperwork completed and most of their assets confiscated by the Nazis, the Maier family boarded the St. Louis. I mentioned that Ludwig's wife Freya is the third person in the photo boarding the St. Louis, but actually there was a far bigger group of family members traveling together on the ship. If you look closely, you can see that Freya is not actually on the boarding gangplank. Instead, she appears to be standing on the other side of the railing. And we believe that around her feet, still standing on the dock in this photo, but too short to appear over the railings of the ramp, was Ludwig and Freya's 4-year-old daughter, Sonia. This is a picture of young Sonia on the passport she needed to use to travel on the St. Louis, a real cutie. And Sonia is also in the second photograph that I mentioned that we have on our photo wall at the opening of our museum. She is a newborn here with her proud parents. I think you may be able to recognize them, Ludwig and Freya, the people boarding the St. Louis, at her grandfather's home. That's when this picture was taken, in Malsch, sometime around 1935. But in addition to the 4 people in the photograph, well, the 3 people you can see plus Sonia, the traveling party included not only Ludwig's parents, David and Lena, but another aunt, and then at least 7 members of the family of David's sister, Caroline Loeb. So altogether, the St. Louis carried either around 14 members of this one family. According to Sonia, there had been some discussion about sending her to safety earlier, either as part of the Kindertransport or other efforts that provided refuge, particularly for Jewish children. But that would have meant separating Sonia from her family. In the end, Freya and Ludwig decided to try and keep the family together and managed to purchase tickets for the entire family on the St. Louis, and equally important, secured landing certificates to enable them to land in Cuba. To give you a sense of the financial investment the Maiers made in traveling, the tickets cost 830 Reichsmark, while the landing certificates were another 375 Reichsmarks each. So just the tickets and landing papers cost 1,205 Reichsmarks per person, or more than 8,000 Reichsmarks for the 7 family members. And to put that in perspective, the average annual salary for a blue or white collar worker in Germany in 1939 was only 2,100 Reichsmarks per year. The cost of the tickets and landing certificates for the 7 Maiers traveling on the St. Louis was about equal to 4 years' average salary in Germany. But the Maiers and others on board figured that the tickets were worth the investment because it would mean saving their lives. The Maier family was like the other passengers on the St. Louis, fleeing Nazi persecution. And most, like the Maiers, were not planning on spending long in Cuba. Instead, most of those on board had applied to enter the United States, but decided it would be safer to wait for their quota number to be called from somewhere outside of Nazi Germany. I don't want to go into full details about the American immigration system at this time, but as you may know, in the 1920s, the United States imposed sharp restrictions on the number of immigrants who could enter the country, setting an annual quota for each country based on the number of Americans who traced their heritage back to their country. Here's the famous political cartoon that captures in an image how the quota system worked. For Germans after 1938's annexation of Austria, the US set the annual quota at 27,370 immigrants. And then that was broken down into monthly quotas of 2,280 people. If more than 2,280 Germans applied to enter America in any month, they were put on a waiting list for the following month or the month after that, which often turned into years. And since the shipping lines that brought immigrants to the United States were responsible for paying the people's return passage for anyone not allowed into the country, the shipping lines quickly started to refuse to sell tickets to immigrants unless they had a valid quota number. The result of this system was that thousands of Germans, eager to get out of Nazi Germany, were forced to wait for their number to be called. Those like the Maiers and the other passengers on the St. Louis thought it would be best to wait somewhere outside of Europe and somewhere close to their final destination. As the St. Louis set sail from Hamburg, following the Elbe into the North Sea, the Maiers and most of the passengers, I'm sure, felt a great sense of relief to get out of Germany. What most did not realize, however, was that a week before the St. Louis set sail, the Cuban president, Federico Laredo Bru, had issued a decree invalidating all recently issued landing certificates. His action was based on a couple of different factors. Partially, it was because information had recently come to light that the Director General of the Cuban Immigration Office, a guy named Manuel Benitez Gonzalez, had been illegally selling landing certificates for about $150 or more each and keeping the money for himself, amassing a small fortune. So the president's invalidation of the landing certificates was part of an effort to combat the corruption in his own administration. The president's action was also in response to growing anti-immigrant sentiment in Cuba. Much like in the United States, Cubans struggled with the economic collapse of the Great Depression, and they resented immigrants who were coming to their country and competing with them for the scarce jobs that were available. And one final factor was anti-Semitism, inflamed by Nazi agents in Cuba who claimed the incoming Jews were communists who wanted to spark a revolution in the country. Indeed, 5 days before the St. Louis arrived in Havana, the city was the site of the largest anti-Semitic demonstration in the nation's history, where more than 40,000 spectators listened as a spokesman for a former Cuban president urged Cubans to, quote, fight the Jews until the last one is driven out. When the St. Louis arrived in Havana on May 27, 1939, the Cuban government admitted 28 of the passengers on board, those who had visas from the United States or were Cuban or Spanish citizens. But 907 passengers who had only transit visas and the landing certificates issued by Manuel Benitez Gonzalez were refused entry and remained aboard the ship. The American press quickly jumped on the story, reporting how there were 900 refugees stuck on this boat in the Havana harbor. And the US-based American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, sent representatives to Cuba to negotiate for the passengers, even offering to post a bond for each passenger to guarantee they would not require support from the Cuban government. But the Cuban president ended the negotiations before anything had been settled. On June 2nd, 1939, he ordered the St. Louis to leave Cuban waters. There were then various appeals to President Roosevelt to allow the ship to dock in America. After all, 743 of the 907 passengers had submitted applications to enter the country, enter the United States. And it appeared that without American action, the passengers would be forced to return to Nazi Germany. But FDR and his administration decided not to act. The State Department stated their position in a telegram sent to passengers saying they must await their turn on the waiting list and qualify for and obtain immigration visas before they may be admissible to enter into the United States. The fact that there had been thousands of unfilled quota spots in the years before 1938 did not weigh into the decision. America stuck to its rules, saying without a valid quota spot, nobody could come in, regardless of what dangers that forced people into. I'm not going to go into detail about what the passengers felt as they learned that the boat was heading back to Germany. I'm sure you can imagine their fears. The New York Times reported on June 1st, 1939, that the captain feared both mass suicide and potential mutiny. Imagine if you'd spent months, maybe years, getting the needed paperwork and approvals to get out of Germany. Imagine, too, that you'd sold your home and furnishings and given up your savings. Emotionally, you had accepted these difficult actions because you decided that anything was better than staying in Germany. And then, after going through all of that, you find that you're going to be sent back, now with no possessions and no wealth. What would you be willing to do to avoid going back? That's how the people felt on board the St. Louis. As the ship turned and steamed back across the Atlantic, it was the JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee, that continued to work for another solution. Their efforts paid off on June 10th and 11th, when 4 European countries agreed to take in the St. Louis passengers. Belgium was the first to act, saying it would take 250 of the 907 passengers. Holland followed, agreeing to take 194. And then England and France stepped in, saying they would each take up to 250 of the passengers. The passengers were then consulted about their preferences, and the fact that any family members might live in these countries also served as a factor in the final decision. Instead of returning to Hamburg, the St. Louis then headed to Antwerp. Those staying in Belgium were allowed to land, while those heading to Holland boarded trains from Antwerp for the final leg of their journey. And passengers who were going to France and England boarded another ship, the SS Curators, which left the following day on June 18th. In the end, 288 passengers went to England, while 224 went to France, 214 chose Belgium, and 181 went to Holland. All 7 members of the Maier family chose to land in England, believing that the English Channel would protect them from Germany more than any land border. As it turned out, that decision helped save their lives. You can see on Sonia's passport the stamp showing her departure from Hamburg on May 13th and her entry into England at Southampton on June 21st, 1939. The 7 members of David's sister's family, the Lobes, decided to stay in Belgium, but when Germany launched its offensive 2 years later, or a year later, they, along with those who had gone to Holland and France, found themselves once again under Nazi rule. It had long been claimed that when the St. Louis was turned away from Cuba and America, those on board returned to Europe and were killed in the Holocaust. We knew that was an overgeneralization, as those in England didn't fall into Nazi hands in the same way as those in the other 3 countries, but the exact details seemed too hard to actually determine. Nonetheless, beginning in the early 2000s, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial and Museum in D.C. undertook a study to track down what happened to all of the 937 passengers who boarded the St. Louis. The result of their study was published in 2010 in the book co-authored by Sarah Ogilvie and Scott Miller entitled Refuge Denied. They found that of the 288 passengers who returned to England, all except 1, who was killed in an air raid in 1940, survived the war. Of the 620 passengers who returned to the continent of Europe, 87 managed to get out of Europe before the Nazi invasion in May of 1940, leaving 532 passengers who were trapped when Germany conquered Western Europe. Of those 532, just over half, 278, survived the Holocaust. But 254 people died, 84 who had settled in Belgium, 84 who had returned to Holland, and 86 who had chosen to go to France. So while Cuba and America's Rejection was not a death sentence for all 907 passengers, it was for 254. For the Loeb family, who traveled on the St. Louis with the Maiers, but who chose to stay in Belgium in June of 1939, we know that 5 of the 7 survived, but Isidore and Caroline, David's sister, were killed. For the Maiers in our photograph who chose England, they survived. Actually, most of the family managed to get to America within less than a year, as they got word that their quota numbers had been called. I'm not sure how many of you track down information about your own family's immigration history, but one of the great tools out there are digitized copies of the shipping manifests that are required to be completed, or that were required to be completed, by every ship coming through Ellis Island. I was able to find the records for Ludwig's family. Here's the shipping manifest from the SS Georgic that, accompanied by a military convoy, left Southampton, England on January 30th, 1940. And you can see the website if you're interested in researching your own family history. Here's a zoomed in version so that you can see the names. Aboard this boat were David Maier and his wife Pauline, or Lena, and Ludwig and his family, Freya and the 4-year-old Sonia. They arrived in New York on February 11th, 1940. According to the ship's manifest, they went to stay with Ludwig's younger sister, Julia, who had sailed to New York on the Queen Mary in the previous March. The arrival of Ludwig, Freya, and Sonia and her grandparents, David and Lena, marked the end of an unbelievable journey for the entire family. Despite being turned away in Cuba and denied entrance to other countries, they survived in Europe after the ship's return and managed to make it to safety in the United States within less than a year. And if that's not amazing enough, when David and Lena arrived in New York, they were welcomed not only by Ludwig and Freya, who traveled with them, but by all of David and Lena's other children, Fred, Julia, Arthur, and Leo. They had all managed to get out of Nazi Germany and to make it safely to America. I know I'm running a little longer than usual, but I wanted to add one more bit of information before I complete this program. Although the story of the St. Louis is relatively well known, the fact is that it was one of a number of ships that were turned away by Cuba and America, and those other ships don't seem to get the same attention. On the same day as the St. Louis steamed into Havana Harbor, the British Pacific Steamship Navigation Company's SS Orduña arrived, carrying 120 Austrian, Czech, and German Jews to Cuba. The Cuban authorities allowed 48 of the Orduña's passengers, who had the needed paperwork, to land, but refused entry to the remaining 72 passengers. After seeking a destination for several weeks, the Orduña's captain got approval for its passengers to land, at least temporarily, in the Panama Canal zone, rather than being required to go back to Europe. At the same time as the Orduña was steaming into the Panama Canal, and while the St. Louis was sat in the harbor in Havana, a third boat arrived in Havana, the SS Flander, carrying 104 German, Austrian, and Czech Jews. When it was denied entry into Cuba, the SS Flander set sail for Mexico, but found no port open to them. Eventually, the ship returned to France, where the Jewish passengers were subsequently interned by the French government. A fourth ship, the Orinoco, faced a similar situation. The Orinoco was actually the sister ship of the St. Louis. It left Hamburg on May 27th with 200 passengers bound for Cuba. It made it out of the North Sea and almost through the English Channel when the captain heard the problems that the St. Louis was facing in Cuba. Rather than continuing toward Havana, the Orinoco diverted to the waters off of Cherbourg, where it waited for days to determine what to do. Despite the recent pleas from those on the Orduña, the St. Louis, and the Flander, no country opened its ports to the Orinoco. Eventually, the United States used its diplomats in London to pressure the German ambassador to give assurances that the German authorities would not persecute the Orinoco refugees upon their return to the German Reich. With that dubious assurance, the 200 refugees on the Orinoco returned to Germany in June of 1939. Their fate remains unknown. There was one ship that faced a different fate. On August 19th, 1940, the Portuguese ship Kwanza docked in New York. It carried 317 passengers, but only 196 had the necessary paperwork to disembark. The remaining 121 people, 85 of whom were Jewish passengers seeking to leave Nazi Germany, remained on board. Like other ships, the Kwanza began to sail to Central America, hoping it would be able to land in Mexico. However, it stopped briefly to load more coal in Norfolk, where a local attorney filed a federal suit that kept the ship in its port for 6 days. And during that time, Jewish groups lobbied Eleanor Roosevelt in particular to get her husband to let this group of refugees stay. And this time, when she appealed to her husband, FDR relented, agreeing to admit this small group of Jews. In the end, 80 of the 86 Jews on board the Kwanza settled in America, while the others chose to return to Europe. It's not really clear why FDR relented for the Kwanza and not for the St. Louis or the Orduña or other ships. FDR left no record for the reason for his decision. Some believe it was because the case of the Kwanza involved only a small number of Jews. Others suggest that by August of 1940, when the Kwanza was facing its challenge, FDR was thinking about the upcoming election and realized the small action on behalf of the Kwanza could help him with the Jewish vote. Regardless, the story of the Kwanza is really the exception that proves the rule. Americans, from the president down, were largely unwilling to admit any immigrants, except through the strictly limited existing structure of the quota laws, which were by themselves a concerted effort to reduce immigration. I should add one more thing, and that's in June of 1939, when the St. Louis sought refuge in Cuba and America, the world did not know what would happen in Germany. There was plenty of evidence, however, of Jews being treated as subhuman, with the removal of their citizenship, the limits on what kind of work they could do, restrictions on their freedom of movement, and attacks on their property and the burning of synagogues. A New York Times editorial on June 8, 1939, as the St. Louis began its return journey to Hamburg, described the ship as the saddest ship afloat. It continued in the editorial, demonstrating how much awareness there was about what was going on in Germany with, and you can see here, it is useless now to discuss what might have been done. The case is disposed of. Germany, with all the hospitality of its concentration camps, will welcome these unfortunate home. In hindsight, the creation of Dachau and the events of Kristallnacht should have been warning signs enough to spur America to help the Jewish refugees. The world should not have needed to see crematoria and gas chambers before it acted to help. For me, this is one of the lessons of the St. Louis. America and other nations need to be willing to help even if all the details about some group's persecution are not yet clear. Acting early is what can save lives. Okay, I know I've gone on longer than I should have. I'm going to stop here. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box. Let me take a moment to just remind you of our other upcoming programs. On July 8th, next Wednesday, I will be leading my next Curator's Corner, talking about a child's shoe that was found in Auschwitz and which stands in our gallery. And next Thursday, July 9th at 11 a.m., Helen Turner, our Director of Education, will be leading one of our bi-monthly virtual gallery tours, although this time focusing particularly on Jewish resistance during the Holocaust. I hope you'll join me for those, and please look on our website at hmtcli.org for other upcoming programs. And finally, let me ask you to make a donation to support online programs like this one. Okay, let me take a look and see what questions you have. How many people in total survived or died? How long was the journey and what were the conditions on the boat? So the conditions on the boat were pretty good. It was actually a pretty upscale boat. It wasn't steerage class. They were called tourist class passengers or first class passengers. And 278 people survived out of, well, actually 254 of the 907 passengers died. So the rest survived. One person asked, how did the Loeb spell their name? Those Loeb spelled it just L-O-B. I've looked for some of their shipping manifests, but I wasn't able to track them down. To what degree did Americans' anti-Semitism play into rejecting the St. Louis? Well, that's a big part of it. It was American anti-Semitism and xenophobia and isolationism that all combined to make the United States popular opinion polls say that they didn't want to let refugees from Germany in. There were some polls taken, and the great majority of Americans after Kristallnacht agreed that the way the German government was treating Jews was bad and problematic. But then when asked if that would mean America should take in German refugees, the great majority of Americans, I think it's somewhere 80 or 90%, said don't. And so that's what FDR was facing, a general American population that didn't want to allow the immigrants in because of anti-Semitism, because of economic concerns, and because of isolationism. What ship did Eleanor beg FDR to allow? She worked on, or she responded for the Kwanzaa, the SS Kwanzaa. That was the ship that she helped FDR change his opinion on. Okay, thanks very much. I'm sorry for running long, and I hope the rest of you, or I hope you have a lovely day. Take care.